allowing yourself to become aware of those aspects. And for me, this anger is because my mother had psychologically controlled me to, I was going to be an apostle at least. The Mormon mother's dream, right, for every son. And I just wasn't allowed to be me. And so there I am in my late 20s, early 30s, and just the childlike rage that came to the surface. And I used to go down to a park close to where I was living. And fortunately, it was a large park. There was a creek running through it. It was pretty isolated. And I just needed to express my anger physically, but there was no way that I was going to do so. Fortunately, I had become intelligent enough, wise enough by that point in my life that I didn't want to lash out at anybody because I didn't want to hurt anybody. I didn't want to destroy property. But I needed to physically express this anger that was just so close to the core of my being. So I used to go down there and find these dead old large logs and branches and pick them up and just smash them against the trees by the edge of the creek, and you'd hear this crack resonating right through the forest, and I would swear that a profanity that would come out of my mouth. I can remember times when I would wake up in the middle of the night. Sometimes I had nightmares, and following the nightmares there would be this intense anger. And I would take a 9-iron and I would hop the back fence into, it was a large school field. This was like 2 in the morning, there's nobody there. And I would club the grass to death. I was just so angry. Once I was in my grandmother's basement, and again, one of these, just these repressed emotions that came up to the surface, and I turned around and it was my own fault. And I punched her concrete foundation wall. Well, you can guess who lost on that very short-term battle. I broke a bone in my hand. It was my own fault. But I needed to do that. I needed to do that for myself because it was a function of my personality, just the intensity I have. And it's going to be different for every one of us. Maybe there's a very sensitive, creative person in this audience. Maybe they've been trying to, keep that lid on that, on grief that they have felt for so many years. And if that's the case, if you sense that about yourself, you need to visit that reservoir of grief as often as it takes to empty it. Think of the number of times where you sat through a fast and testimony meeting, and someone would get up to the podium and begin their testimony, and then the waterworks would start. I used to be one of those people. I could not bear my testimony without just blubbering, just crying hard. And after I left the church, I thought, I was thinking about that. Why would that be a reality for me? And by the way, members would always come up to me afterwards and say, that was such a spiritual a lovely testimony. I felt the Spirit so strongly. And yet I just feel like crap. Embarrassed. And what I determined, at least for myself, was, when you're up there, you're in front of people, you're making yourself vulnerable. You're talking about your feelings about the church, about things that have been going on in your life. And so this emotion starts coming up to the surface. But if there's mixed in with this emotion a huge amount of grief that you've never been allowed to acknowledge, then it's going to be there as well, and it's going to manifest itself. And that's, so what I needed to do for myself is I needed to grieve, and I spent a long time grieving for pain and losses. And any psychotherapist will, you get into, if you ever do psychotherapy, you're going to get into that kind of stuff. It's feeling and working through the emotional and psychological pain resulting from abuse, for example. It's all part of this legitimate suffering. because you have to deal with it. Sooner or later you have to deal with it because it's going to be impacting your personal life, your relationships, maybe your situation at work, just so many aspects of your life. And the reason why people avoid their legitimate suffering work, if you will, is because they sense at some level of awareness that there is going to be pain involved, emotional pain. And it's totally natural for us not to want to go there. And yet if that's something that we need to do for ourselves, then you have to do it. You have to take that step, and you have to muster that courage and go into that pain, because the only way to deal with it is to deal with it. Maybe part of our legitimate suffering is confronting people who have mistreated us, maybe family members or somebody else. Establishing boundaries when our learned tendency has been to be silent. So that's just part of the legitimate suffering process. Shortly after I left the church and I was going through my local library looking for materials about trying to figure out how Mormonism had affected me psychologically, I came across some recorded lectures by Dr. Nathaniel Brandon, who was an American psychologist who pioneered the study of self-esteem. And he did this like 40 plus years ago. Started out looking at people in the military, what makes a confident person in the military context. And he has published a number of books on self-esteem, and one of his books, The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, for me is one of the 5 most influential books that came into my life. And from that book and from his recorded lectures on self-esteem, Dr. Brandon formulated that self-esteem, to trust your mind and to know that one is worthy of happiness, is the essence of self-esteem. And yet, Mormonism conditions people to betray their mind, and as a Latter-day Saint, you're only worthy of happiness if you are completely obedient. And I'm going to get into that in greater depth just in a moment. More specifically, self-esteem is a feeling worthy and deserving. The reputation that we acquire with ourselves over time, particularly with our mind. Confidence in our ability to think correctly and in our judgments. Confidence in our ability to cope with the basic challenges of life. Confidence in our right to be happy and successful, however we define success for ourselves. A feeling of being entitled to assert our needs and wants, develop our values, and enjoy the fruits of our labor.